Before dawn broke over the sodden jungles and mist-choked coastline of eastern New Guinea, few could have imagined that a remote stretch of swamp and coral mud would become the stage for one of the most consequential turning points of World War II. Milne Bay, an obscure crescent of land tucked beneath towering ridgelines and lashed endlessly by tropical storms, seemed, at first glance, a place destined only for hardship, disease, and logistical misery. Yet in the dark months of 1942, with the Japanese Empire expanding like a rising tide across the Pacific, this muddy outpost suddenly transformed into a front line that would shape the momentum of the war. For the Japanese High Command, Milne Bay represented a daring opportunity. Its capture would complete a tightening noose around Australia, extending the Empire's defensive perimeter and threatening Allied communication routes. More importantly, the seizure of its newly constructed airstrips promised air dominance over the Coral Sea, a strategic advantage that could disrupt Allied counteroffensives and protect their operations in New Guinea. Confident from a string of early victories, the Japanese believed the operation would be swift, decisive, and inevitable. But Milne Bay was far from undefended. On the ground were Australian infantry brigades, American engineers, local militia, and a growing presence of Allied air power. These forces, hardened by weeks of punishing labor in hostile terrain, had turned the bay into a fortress of determination. Their boots sank into mud with every step, their supplies spoiled in relentless rain, and their bodies were ravaged by malaria and exhaustion. Yet despite these hardships, the defenders forged a unity and resolve that would soon be tested like never before. When Japanese landing forces touched shore under the cover of night, they expected a rapid push inland. What they found instead was a nightmare. An enemy prepared, airfields defended by fierce resistance, and skies dominated by Allied aircraft capable of striking with brutal precision. The dense jungle, thought to be an ally, quickly betrayed them. Paths dissolved into quagmires, visibility vanished in sheets of rain, and communication dissolved as units became separated in the dark labyrinth of trees. The ensuing battle was unlike any seen in the Pacific to that point. A brutal, rain-soaked struggle fought over airstrips, narrow jungle tracks, and mosquito-infested swamps. For days, Japanese units hurled themselves against dug-in Australian positions, often fighting at point-blank range in mud that swallowed rifles and boots alike. Machine guns jammed from the wet. Aircraft skidded on submerged runways, and the battlefield became an arena of chaos where the line between survival and disaster was measured by inches. Yet, amid the thunder of artillery, the roar of aircraft engines, and the relentless downpour, the Allied defense held. With every counterattack, every defensive stand, every successful air sortie, the myth of Japanese ground invincibility, carefully crafted through months of rapid conquests, began to crack. And when the Japanese finally withdrew under cloak of darkness, abandoning equipment and leaving behind their dead, Milne Bay entered history as the first decisive land defeat of Japanese forces in World War II. The victory carried far more weight than the geography of the battlefield suggested. It was a beacon of hope in a dark chapter of the war. Proof that the enemy could be pushed back, that the momentum of defeat could be reversed. For Australia, it became a symbol of national resolve and military maturation. For the Allies, it marked the beginning of a broader resurgence in the Pacific. And for the Japanese Empire, unaccustomed to retreat, it was a sobering sign that the tide was turning. Milne Bay's transformation from obscurity into a cornerstone of Allied strategy did not occur by accident. It arose from a convergence of intelligence assessments, geographic calculations, and the hard-earned lessons of early Pacific defeats. As Allied planners regrouped after the devastating losses of early 1942, they realized that every remaining foothold between Australia and the advancing Japanese required reinforcement. Milne Bay, lying like a natural harbor at the tip of Papua, emerged as an ideal position from which the Allies could project air power, intercept enemy shipping, and guard the vulnerable approaches to Port Moresby. The more analysts studied the region, the more they understood that this muddy, rain-soaked outpost possessed the potential to alter the tempo of the entire New Guinea campaign. The decision to turn Milne Bay into a major base also reflected the shifting nature of the war. Air superiority, once a supplementary factor, was quickly becoming the determining force in Pacific operations. Whoever controlled the skies over New Guinea controlled the supply routes, the movement of troops, and the security of the coastline. The Japanese understood this well, having used air power to devastating effect throughout Southeast Asia. The Allies understood it too, which is why the rapid construction of airfields at Milne Bay became an absolute priority. These runways, little more than strips of gravel, mud, and bulldozed swamp, would soon host fighter squadrons that could challenge Japanese air raids and provide the first line of defense against amphibious assault. Yet Milne Bay's newfound strategic value brought monumental challenges. Engineers and infantry units faced an environment as hostile as any enemy force. Heavy rains pounded the ground until entire work sites dissolved into sludge. Spiders, snakes, and mosquitoes filled every crevice of the jungle. Men found themselves fighting not only exhaustion, but tropical disease, particularly malaria, which threatened to overwhelm entire units before bullets ever flew. Supply convoys struggled to deliver ammunition, fuel, and machinery through seas prone to sudden storms and skies often claimed by enemy aircraft. Every plank of wood, every barrel of petrol, and every piece of machinery represented a victory over the terrain itself. Still, the work pushed forward at a relentless pace. Australian infantry provided perimeter defense, while American engineer battalions carved the beginnings of the runways that would later define the battle's outcome. Makeshift workshops appeared in clearings barely large enough to accommodate them. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned at key intervals, their crews training day and night in anticipation of Japanese bombing runs. Gradually, hangars took shape. Ammunition depots rose, and command posts began to coordinate a growing force that blended Australian combat experience with American technical expertise. One of the most pivotal contributions to Milne Bay's defenses came not from infrastructure but from intelligence. Allied reconnaissance flights from Port Moresby provided early warnings of Japanese activity around Buna, Rabaul, and the Solomon Sea. Australian coast watchers, scattered across remote islands and jungle outposts, intercepted Japanese radio traffic and tracked convoys attempting to move southward. Their reports confirmed what many commanders already suspected. Japan had not abandoned its ambition to capture Port Moresby, and Milne Bay stood directly in the path of this ambition. Each intercepted signal intensified the sense of urgency, and each sighting reinforced the belief that the enemy's assault was not a matter of if, but when. Japanese military planners, for their part, viewed Milne Bay as both an opportunity and an obstacle. Their confidence stemmed from the belief that the Allied presence there was weak, no more than a few hundred men with light defenses. This intelligence error, based on outdated reconnaissance and misinterpretation of aerial photographs, led to one of the most consequential miscalculations of the Pacific War. In reality, more than 8,000 Allied troops were stationed at Milne Bay by late August 1942, including some of the most seasoned Australian brigades. They were supported by a growing fleet of Kitty Hawk fighters, fully operational runways, and a defensive network designed specifically to repel amphibious attacks. What made Milne Bay even more critical was its connection to the broader strategic puzzle unfolding across the Pacific. The Kokoda Track campaign was raging simultaneously, with Japanese forces attempting to reach Port Moresby from the north over rugged mountain ranges. If those forces could be supported from the sea through Milne Bay, the Australians defending Kokoda would be caught in a deadly pincer movement. The fall of Milne Bay would therefore jeopardize not just one outpost, but the entire defensive line protecting Australia's northern approaches. Commanders in Brisbane, Melbourne, and Port Moresby all recognized this danger, and they viewed Milne Bay as the linchpin holding the Allied position together. As August progressed, the sense of inevitability thickened across the Allied positions. Patrols reported increased enemy reconnaissance flights. Radar operators intercepted signals indicating maritime activity near Goodenough Island. Rumors circulated among the infantry that Japanese barges had been spotted moving southward. Even the jungle seemed to grow still in anticipation, as if aware that thousands of soldiers were preparing for the clash that would soon engulf the region. The tension built, sharpened by the knowledge that this remote outpost, once dismissed as strategically irrelevant, had become a battlefield upon which the fate of the South Pacific might hinge. Thus, as the final days before the Japanese landing drew near, Milne Bay existed in a state of fevered preparation. Supplies were stockpiled, trenches were dug, and weapon pits were reinforced. Communication lines were tested and retested. Every man understood the stakes, for word had spread that the Japanese considered this attack critical to their momentum in the region. What the Allied soldiers did not know, however, was that they were about to participate in a moment of historic significance, a battle that would shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility on land and prove that even in the most unrelenting terrain, determination, coordination, and strategic foresight could triumph over enemy ambition. The Japanese approach to Milne Bay in late August 1942 stemmed from a critical misreading of both Allied strength and the physical environment of New Guinea's eastern peninsula. Convinced that Allied forces stationed there were limited to a small garrison of engineers and light infantry, Japanese planners believed they could swiftly overwhelm the defenders, seize the airfields, and establish a forward base from which air raids and amphibious operations against Port Moresby could be launched. This confidence, bordering on overreach, was built upon fragmented intelligence, outdated reconnaissance, and an unwavering faith in the prowess of their elite special naval landing forces, the Japanese equivalent of Marines, who had accumulated a fearsome reputation in earlier campaigns. In planning the operation, the Japanese command assessed the mission as a relatively moderate undertaking. Their perception was rooted in a belief that Milne Bay's inhospitable terrain would keep Allied forces light and unprepared. Swamps, torrential rains, and thick jungle growth made the area notoriously difficult to inhabit, let alone fortify. Japanese strategists thus reasoned that the Allies would never assign large numbers of troops to such a remote and harsh region. They saw Milne Bay not as a fortress, but as a logistical outpost, one that could be captured with decisive speed. Their confidence was bolstered by successes in the region. The Japanese had conducted rapid amphibious invasions across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with remarkable efficiency. They had taken Rabaul, Leh, Salamaua, and numerous island chains with comparatively low casualties. Each successful landing reinforced the belief within the Imperial Japanese Navy that their amphibious doctrine was virtually flawless. Even setbacks like the Battle of the Coral Sea had not shaken their faith in their infantry's ability to dominate land engagements once ashore. Yet beneath this veneer of confidence lay cracks in their strategic assumptions. Their reconnaissance flights over Milne Bay, conducted at high altitude to avoid Allied fighters, failed to detect the rapid buildup of Australian brigades arriving secretly from Port Moresby. Nor did they observe the American engineers who were expanding the airstrips with astonishing speed, or the defensive positions concealed beneath the jungle canopy. A clearer, closer view would have revealed hundreds of camouflaged gun pits, reinforced trenches, staging areas, and stockpiles of ammunition ready for battle. But the Japanese relied on flawed aerial photography and outdated intelligence that suggested the Allies had only a few hundred troops in the area. Thus, the Japanese invasion force departed Rabaul under false assumptions, carrying with them orders that reflected misplaced optimism rather than the harsh reality awaiting them. Their landing force consisted of approximately 2,000 men, including the 5th Kure Special Naval Landing Force, the 5th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, and several platoons of labor troops intended to secure the airfields after the expected swift victory. While these were elite fighters, they were not prepared for prolonged combat in unforgiving terrain against a well-entrenched and numerically superior enemy. The journey southward toward Milne Bay was itself indicative of the challenges they would soon face. As their convoy moved through the Solomon Sea, it encountered heavy seas and thick cloud cover, conditions that hampered navigation and delayed their schedule. Rough waters scattered several landing barges, forcing the fleet to regroup repeatedly. Fuel consumption increased, rationing became necessary, and communication across the fleet was disrupted. Every delay chipped away at the precision required for a night landing, and uncertainty began to take hold among the officers. When the Japanese finally approached Milne Bay on the night of 25th–26th August, heavy rain obscured the coastline. Darkness, storms, and confused navigation caused the landing force to miss their designated beaches by several kilometers. Instead of landing near the lightly defended eastern tip, they came ashore closer to the Australian positions and the very airstrips they had hoped to capture quickly. This error, born from a combination of weather and inadequate reconnaissance, would alter the course of the entire battle. The landing itself unfolded in a chaos that contrasted sharply with the clockwork efficiency of previous Japanese operations. As the first waves of landing barges hit the shore, troops disembarked into knee-deep mud and found themselves immediately slowed by the swampy terrain. The rain had turned the ground into a quagmire, and equipment became waterlogged. Machine guns clogged, ammunition belts sagged, and communication lines broke down as radios failed in the humid, storm-soaked environment. Officers struggled to reorganize their men, who could barely see more than a few paces ahead due to the relentless downpour. Despite the disarray, the Japanese infantry pressed inward, their discipline and training propelling them forward through the hostile terrain. But every step confronted them with resistance they did not expect. Australian forward patrols, already alerted to the possibility of an enemy landing, engaged the Japanese vanguard almost immediately. The initial firefights were brief but intense, with tracer rounds slicing through the darkness and the sounds of rifles echoing across the drenched jungle. The Japanese quickly realized they were facing a far more organized defense than anticipated. As they pushed inland, the Japanese encountered carefully prepared defensive positions shielding the approaches to the airfields. Australian machine gun nests opened fire from concealed locations, and mortar rounds crashed into the advancing Japanese lines, splintering trees and throwing mud high into the air. Each attempt to break through was met with fierce resistance. Their expectation of encountering a lightly defended engineering outpost had been shattered. Instead, they were fighting veteran Australian brigades prepared for a full-scale assault. Compounding their difficulties was the terrain itself, which negated many of their usual advantages. The jungle prevented coordinated movement, forcing the Japanese into narrow columns easily targeted by Allied ambushes. Swamps bogged down their progress, stripping them of momentum. Supply lines lagged behind, and ammunition ran low far sooner than expected. The small force had been prepared for a rapid, decisive action, not a prolonged engagement against a determined enemy in punishing conditions. As dawn approached, the Japanese found themselves in a critical dilemma. They had failed to capture their initial objectives, their landing had gone awry, and their troops were exhausted from night fighting in near impossible conditions. Yet retreat was not considered an option. Their commanders believed that with daylight would come an opportunity to regroup and renew the offensive. What they did not know was that Allied air power, particularly the Kitty Hawks stationed at the very airfields they had hoped to capture quickly, would unleash devastating strikes upon their exposed positions. The Japanese, having underestimated both the weather and the strength of the Allied forces, now faced a battle unlike any they had fought before, a grueling contest for survival in a landscape that favored not the attacker but the defenders who knew every inch of the terrain. The struggle for control of the airfields at Milne Bay formed the beating heart of the battle, a grueling contest defined by mud, darkness, torrential rain, and relentless close-quarters combat. After their chaotic night landing, the Japanese believed they could still seize the airstrips with a renewed push at dawn, but what awaited them was a wall of resistance far more formidable than anything their pre-invasion intelligence had predicted. The airfields, number 1, number 2, and the partially constructed number 3, were the lifeline of the Allied position, the very reason Milne Bay held strategic importance. To the Australians defending them, losing the airstrips meant not only the collapse of their foothold, but also the potential collapse of the defense of Port Moresby itself. With such high stakes, neither side could afford to falter. As dawn broke on 26 August, the skies were thick with low-hanging clouds, and relentless rain transformed the battleground into a mosaic of mud, puddles, and flooded trenches. The Australians positioned around number 3 airstrip listened for movement through the downpour, their uniforms soaked, their helmets dripping, their boots caked with mud so heavy it made each step a labor. The Kitty Hawks of number 75 and number 76 squadrons were grounded temporarily due to the storms, leaving the infantrymen to face the full brunt of the Japanese advance without air support. But the Australians were seasoned by months of harsh New Guinea campaigning, and the jungle, unforgiving, thick, and treacherous, was an ally they understood far better than the attackers. The Japanese assault at first light targeted the eastern end of number 3 airfield. They advanced in tight formations, moving with the discipline of elite naval infantry, but the terrain immediately worked against them. Mud sucked at their boots, machine gun crews struggled to keep their weapons dry, and visibility was so poor that units became scattered, forced to navigate more by instinct than by coordinated command. Nevertheless, they pushed forward with remarkable determination, expecting that once they broke through the perimeter, the remainder of the Allied line would collapse in sequence. Instead, they met one of the fiercest defensive stands of the entire New Guinea campaign. Australian Vickers machine guns positioned beneath carefully camouflaged firing pits unleashed devastating bursts that cut through the jungle. Mortar crews dropped round after round onto the narrowing advance lanes, turning the muddy ground into a churning hellscape of explosions and flying debris. Every time the Japanese attempted to fan out and envelop the defenders, they found their flanks blocked by swamps or deep lagoons, narrowing the battlefield into deadly choke points where the Australians' fields of fire overlapped with lethal precision. The Japanese persisted, launching repeated assaults despite mounting casualties. Their officers, using whistles and shouted commands barely audible through the storm, rallied the troops again and again. Many Japanese soldiers fought with an intensity born of their reputation as shock troops, pressing forward even as rain washed the blood from their uniforms and mud clung to their rifles. They advanced so close to the Australian lines at times that hand-to-hand combat erupted, bayonets flashing between the shadows of palm trees and the silhouettes of shattered coconut plantations. But as the morning wore on, the impossible conditions that had allowed them to land undetected now turned against them. The rain eased just long enough for the Kitty Hawks to take to the skies once more. The moment their engines roared overhead, the entire complexion of the battle changed. Fighter pilots of numbers 75 and 76 squadrons swept low over the airfield, strafing and bombing Japanese positions with ruthless accuracy. The attackers, caught in the open on the fringes of the airstrip, were forced to scatter into the jungle, their assault momentum broken by the sudden return of Allied air power. Despite the setback, the Japanese regrouped for a second determined assault. By late afternoon, they massed for another push, this time along the inland approach toward No. 1 airfield. Their commanders believed that if they could bypass the Allies' strongest concentrations and hit the older strip, they might fracture the defenders' cohesion and force a withdrawal. But this plan, too, encountered a formidable wall of resistance. The Australians defending No. 1 airfield were veterans of North Africa and Greece, soldiers who had endured tanks, trenches, and desert warfare. Though exhausted and dripping wet, they held their ground with unwavering resolve. Bren gunners raked the tree lines with sustained fire, while riflemen picked off Japanese soldiers attempting to probe the perimeter. The ground around the airstrip quickly became a swamp of churned earth, shattered foliage, and discarded gear. Japanese dead lay scattered across the approaches, silent testimony to the ferocity of the fighting. Nightfall brought no relief. Instead, it ushered in a new phase of terror marked by close-quarters ambushes, sudden flares of gunfire, and the constant threat of infiltration. Rain hammered the metal surfaces of aircraft and soaked the trenches until they resembled shallow rivers. The Australians could barely see their own hands, let alone the enemy, but they listened. Every snapping twig, every splash, every whisper of movement mattered. The Japanese excelled at night fighting, and their pressure on the airfields intensified after sunset. Several times they breached the outer defenses, only to be thrown back by counterattacks that turned the sodden ground into hand-to-hand battlegrounds lit only by sporadic muzzle flashes. The fiercest clash occurred along the taxiway leading to No. 3 airstrip, where a Japanese force nearly succeeded in overrunning a section of the Australian line. A desperate bayonet charge, led by officers armed with pistols and trench knives, broke through the thinning line, forcing the defenders into a temporary retreat. But the Australians rallied with remarkable speed. Reinforcements arrived from the southern perimeter, and together the combined force launched a fierce countercharge that expelled the Japanese and re-secured the position. When the gunfire finally subsided, the ground was littered with bodies, weapons, and torn uniforms, grim markers of how close the airstrip had come to falling. As dawn rose on 27 August, the battlefield revealed the staggering toll of the previous day's clashes. Shell craters dotted the approaches to the airfields. Trees were shredded by gunfire. Wrecked Japanese barges and equipment lay half buried in the mud. But the Australians still held the airfields, their positions battered but unbroken. The Kitty Hawks, lined along the runways with wings dripping rainwater, were again ready to take off at the first break in the weather. For the Japanese, the situation had grown dire. Their supply lines were stretched, ammunition was running low, and their troops were exhausted from the relentless pressure. Yet their commanders clung to the belief that the airfields could still be taken with one more decisive push. What they did not yet understand was that the rain-soaked struggle for the airstrips had become a war of attrition, one the Allies were increasingly positioned to win. The Japanese assault on Milne Bay, once envisioned as a swift and decisive operation, had devolved into a grinding struggle against an enemy far stronger than anticipated, and a landscape that resisted every step forward. By 27-28 August 1942, the attackers had lost the strategic initiative, and the momentum began to tilt unmistakably toward the Allies. Yet the shift did not occur in a single dramatic moment. Rather, it emerged through a series of deliberate, coordinated, and often heroic countermeasures undertaken by Australian and American forces who refused to yield the vital airstrips. What followed was an Allied counteroffensive executed not from a position of comfort or superiority, but from exhaustion, grit, and an unshakable determination to hold the line. The conditions under which the counteroffensive began were as brutal as any faced in the New Guinea campaign. The troops at Milne Bay had endured days of continuous rain, sleepless nights punctuated by infiltration attempts, and the psychological strain of a persistent enemy lurking in the jungle shadows. The mud was so thick that soldiers often lost their boots while moving, forced to claw them out by hand or march barefoot through swamp and sludge. Malaria and tropical sores weakened even the healthiest men, yet the Aussies fought on, driven by the knowledge that the fall of the airfields would endanger all of New Guinea and potentially Australia itself. Despite these hardships, Allied command recognized a critical advantage. The Japanese were overextended, low on supplies, and increasingly shaken by the resistance they had encountered. Their landing force had been severely depleted by the initial engagements, and their supply chain, dependent on small, vulnerable barges, had been disrupted by both the weather and persistent Allied airstrikes. The Japanese troops were wet, hungry, exhausted, and fighting in an environment utterly unlike the battles they had previously dominated in Southeast Asia. Sensing this vulnerability, Major General Cyril Close, commander of the Milne Force, prepared to turn the tide. The first step of the counteroffensive was to stabilize and reinforce the defensive perimeter around the airfields. Fresh units rotated into the front lines where possible, while forward companies redistributed ammunition, medical supplies, and rations among the exhausted troops. The Kitty Hawks, having played a pivotal role in halting earlier Japanese advances, resumed aggressive sorties whenever cloud cover permitted. They strafed Japanese positions, destroyed supply barges attempting to land reinforcements, and bombed enemy staging areas hidden within the jungle canopy. These air operations not only inflicted casualties but shattered Japanese morale, reminding them that their hope of seizing the airfields was slipping further from reach. With defensive stability regained, Close ordered a series of probing attacks aimed at reclaiming the ground lost during the previous days. These counterattacks were often small in scale. Platoon-strength advances launched through thick mud and tangled undergrowth, but each one forced the Japanese to react, tiring them further and exposing their weakened flanks. Australian patrols advanced cautiously, testing resistance, mapping enemy positions, and marking routes for larger offensives to follow. The jungle echoed with sporadic rifle fire, the thud of mortar rounds, and the shouts of soldiers advancing through knee-deep muck as they pushed the attackers back yard by yard. The turning point of the counteroffensive came on the night of 28-29 August when the Japanese launched what they believed would be their final, decisive push toward the airstrips. Under heavy rain and near total darkness, they surged forward, hoping to overwhelm the Australians with the same night-fighting prowess that had brought them victories across the Pacific. But by now, the defenders had adapted. Trip flares illuminated the jungle. Vickers machine guns poured fire into the advancing lines, and mortar teams, guided by sound and instinct, blanketed the approaches with high-explosive shells. The Japanese, already exhausted, found themselves charging into prepared defenses that shredded their formations and left the survivors disoriented and scattered. When dawn broke, the battlefield revealed the devastating failure of this final Japanese assault. Their dead lay scattered across the sodden ground, and their retreating units, now recognizing the impossibility of capturing the airfields, fell back toward their original landing zones. For the first time since the battle began, the Australians could sense that the momentum had shifted decisively. Close ordered a full counteroffensive to begin at once, determined to push the Japanese back before they could regroup or receive reinforcements. The Australian advance that followed was relentless. Infantry companies moved out in coordinated waves, supported by Bren carriers that struggled through the mud but provided vital firepower and mobility. Flamethrower teams, engineers, and light artillery pieces moved into position as the offensive deepened. Progress was slow, often measured in meters rather than kilometers, but every step forward brought the Allies closer to driving the invaders into the sea. Japanese strongpoints, hidden behind fallen logs or camouflaged within the jungle canopy, were assaulted with grenades and close-quarters fire. Hand-to-hand combat erupted again and again as stubborn enemy pockets fought to the last man. The rain hammered the battlefield, turning the jungle terrain into a nightmare. Leeches latched onto exposed skin, mosquitoes swarmed, and men slipped on wet roots or sank waist-deep into mud as they advanced. Yet the Australians pressed forward relentlessly, buoyed by the knowledge that the Japanese were finally on the defensive. Each captured position, each abandoned supply cache, and each silent machine gun nest reinforced the truth the invaders were weakening. One of the fiercest engagements of the counteroffensive occurred near KB Mission, where Japanese forces had established a defensive perimeter in hopes of delaying the Allied advance. The Australians assaulted the position from multiple directions, using coordinated fire and maneuver tactics honed in earlier campaigns. Fighting raged along narrow jungle trails and through thickets so dense that soldiers could barely see their own comrades. By the time the position was secured, dozens of Japanese soldiers had been killed, and the survivors withdrew in disarray toward the coastline. By 30 August, the Japanese retreat had turned into a desperate scramble for survival. The Allies captured abandoned equipment, rations, ammunition, and even diaries revealing the extent of Japanese exhaustion and illness. Their invaders' morale, once bolstered by their reputation for invincibility, was now broken. Their commanders began preparing for evacuation, recognizing that remaining ashore would mean annihilation. The shoreline of Milne Bay had witnessed many desperate struggles since the first Japanese boots touched its sodden ground, but nothing compared to the final bays of their presence there. By late August 1942, the Japanese command, outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outpaced, found itself attempting to salvage something from a situation rapidly spiraling beyond their control. What had begun as a bold and confident operation meant to seize a strategically vital airstrip had now deteriorated into a grim fight for survival. The myth of Japanese invincibility, painstakingly cultivated through early Pacific victories, was about to shatter on the muddy tracks and rain-filled trenches of Milne Bay. The early signs of collapse were subtle but unmistakable. Stragglers arriving at Japanese field posts reported heavy casualties, missing commanders, and increasing pressure from Allied infantry units. The relentless rainfall, once thought to be an inconvenience for both sides, became an added enemy for the retreating Japanese. Equipment sank into the mud, ammunition spoiled, and medical supplies dwindled. Morale, once ironclad, began to soften under the unbearable strain of exhaustion and hopelessness. Commanders realized the grim truth: the mission had failed. The foothold they had fought so fiercely to establish could no longer be held. As the calendar turned to the final days of August, the Japanese High Command aboard their offshore vessels debated the feasibility of reinforcing the original landing force. Intelligence was murky, communication intermittent, and the terrain unyielding. Every calculation pointed toward the same reality: further reinforcement would only delay an inevitable collapse while risking even greater losses. The decision, though painful, was clear: a withdrawal must begin. Under the cover of tropical storms and thick coastal mist, Japanese units would attempt to slip back toward their extraction points before Allied forces could fully close the noose around them. Meanwhile, the Allied forces sensed a shift. Patrols reported decreased resistance, abandoned Japanese positions, and signs of hasty retreat. Discarded packs, ration tins, and even personal diaries left behind in the mud. Australian units, particularly the battle-hardened infantry companies that had endured some of the fiercest engagements of the campaign, pushed aggressively to ensure no regrouping could take place. Air support from the RAF and RAAF acted as a constant shadow over the battlefield, strafing potential escape routes and disrupting communication among the withdrawing Japanese. Each passing hour tightened the pressure on the disintegrating invaders. The decisive moment came when Japanese forces attempted to consolidate near the coastal track leading back to their landing point. What they found was a battlefield transformed by earlier engagements: destroyed vehicles, felled trees, deep craters, and the lingering scent of smoke. The terrain offered little room for maneuvering, and Allied forward elements had begun to close in from multiple directions. Forced into narrow, predictable pathways, Japanese retreat groups found themselves exposed to ambushes, artillery harassment, and relentless gunfire. The once disciplined formations now broke into small clusters, each group trying desperately to reach the safety of the shoreline. At last, under the veil of a violent tropical storm, the evacuation began. Small transport vessels and barges edged cautiously toward the coast, picking up whatever remnants of the landing force managed to reach the rendezvous point. Many would never make it. Some were captured, some perished from wounds or exhaustion, while others were swallowed by the impenetrable jungle. The evacuation, though partially successful, underscored the scale of the defeat. Hundreds of casualties, lost equipment, shattered morale, and an objective utterly failed. The Japanese commanders, huddled aboard their vessels, understood the gravity of the moment. For the first time on land in the Pacific War, they had been decisively defeated. News of the Japanese withdrawal spread quickly throughout Allied lines. Soldiers, drenched and exhausted, allowed themselves rare moments of celebration. The victory was not just tactical, it was psychological. Milne Bay became the first unmistakable demonstration that the Japanese ground forces, once feared as unstoppable, could be beaten through determination, coordination, and effective use of terrain and air power. For Australia, the victory carried even deeper meaning. It marked the defense of their homeland's approaches and showcased the resolve of their rapidly maturing fighting force. Yet even as the battlefield quieted, the cost was apparent. The muddy tracks bore the scars of weeks of unrelenting combat. Makeshift graves dotted the landscape. Equipment lay half-buried in the muck, silent witnesses to the furious struggle that had taken place. The Allied soldiers, though victorious, walked the ground with a solemn understanding of what had been sacrificed. Milne Bay had been held, but not without great effort and loss. The Battle of Milne Bay did more than shape the outcome of a single campaign. It reshaped the psychology, strategy, and momentum of the entire Pacific War. At a time when Japanese forces had swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with an aura of unstoppable power, Milne Bay delivered a shock that reverberated across oceans. The Japanese army, on land, could be beaten decisively. For the Allies, especially Australia, this victory was not simply a military achievement, but a crucial moment of self-belief, a confirmation that the tides of war were finally beginning to turn. In the days following the battle, commanders and soldiers alike reflected on how this triumph had been secured. The terrain, which had been expected to favor the Japanese, instead became a powerful ally to the defenders. Mud, rain, and dense vegetation slowed the Japanese advance to a crawl, while Allied forces, accustomed to the punishing conditions after weeks of preparation, maneuvered with increasing confidence. But it was the combination of determination, discipline, and the integration of air and ground power that ultimately ensured success. The defenders of Milne Bay were not passive victims of circumstance. They were active masters of a battlefield in which every meter of ground had been contested with extraordinary resolve. As reports of the Japanese withdrawal reached Allied headquarters, the symbolic significance of the victory became immediately clear. Around the world, newspapers carried headlines celebrating the achievement. For the first time since the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Allies could point to a major land engagement where Japanese troops had not merely withdrawn, but had been forced to retreat in disarray. The psychological impact was enormous. Soldiers on other fronts drew strength from the example set at Milne Bay, viewing the battle as proof that the Japanese war machine was not as invincible as once believed. For Australia, the legacy carried even deeper emotional weight. The defense of Milne Bay validated years of military reform and proved the effectiveness of its rapidly expanding army. The victory became a point of national pride, symbolizing resilience in the face of a dire threat to the homeland. It demonstrated that Australian forces could not only defend their territory, but also inflict significant defeats on a powerful adversary. The battle became embedded in Australia's military identity, remembered as a pivotal moment in which the nation stepped confidently into its role as a crucial player in the Pacific theater. Milne Bay also influenced Japanese strategic thought. The defeat triggered intense introspection within high command. Earlier victories had encouraged overconfidence, reinforcing a belief that superior tactics and fanatical dedication would overwhelm any opposition. Milne Bay shattered this illusion. Commanders were forced to confront the reality that Allied forces were adapting, improving, and resisting with unexpected tenacity. The Japanese military, already stretched thin across a massive front, now faced a more formidable and determined enemy than ever before. The defeat signaled that future offensives would require greater logistical planning, stronger coordination between Army and Navy units, and a more realistic assessment of enemy capabilities, lessons that were acknowledged but implemented too late to alter the war's eventual trajectory. Yet the legacy of Milne Bay extends beyond strategy, morale, and national pride. It stands as a testament to the evolving art of combined arms warfare in the Pacific. The battle showcased the importance of integrated operations, where air power supported ground units with precision and consistency. It demonstrated how rapid construction of airfields, timely reinforcements, and the use of armored vehicles in jungle conditions could turn the tide of battle. The Allies refined these tactics in the months that followed, applying them to devastating effect across New Guinea, the Solomons, and beyond. In this way, Milne Bay became a blueprint for future victories and an early marker of the strategic evolution that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific Campaign. As veterans of the battle aged, their stories became an essential part of the historical memory of World War II. Many spoke of the relentless rain, the knee-deep mud, and the eerie glow of signal flares cutting through the darkness as Japanese infantry pressed their attacks. They remembered the deafening roar of Allied aircraft overhead, the harsh stench of the swamp, and the weight of knowing that the fate of the region rested on their ability to hold the line. These first-hand accounts ensured that Milne Bay was not reduced to a sterile strategic footnote. It remained a deeply human story of endurance, sacrifice, and unyielding resolve.